So I played a game recently, and I really enjoyed it. We played it on stream, and that game was Metroid Dread. It was an awesome playthrough. I had a lot of fun playing through it. But here's the one thing that I heard nonstop about Metroid Dread when it was coming out, and people were talking about it. And that is that this game has no content, that it was super short, it wasn't worth $60. This is a discussion that I've seen not just with Metroid Dread, but with a lot of other video games that have come out over the past few years. I wanted to sort of talk about this idea that a game has no content, right? Or like a game isn't worth $60, because I think it's a really interesting way of how we talk about games. And I feel like it's a criticism that definitely has valid intentions, but it's too often overused to kind of critique the value of a game. Let's look at the argument to begin with. So why do people feel like games should be long? People feel this way for a variety of reasons, and a lot of those reasons are justified. So let's go into the first one, and that's that most people don't have the opportunity to purchase and play a lot of games, which is completely fair, especially in this day and age where things are just getting super expensive and people have to like really think about how they use their money. And with games getting even more expensive too, like now we're starting to see some next gen stuff cost upwards of like $70, and that's probably going to get standardized in a few years. Not everyone can buy every game that looks like it may interest them, and because of that, they want games that they do actually purchase to last them a good while. Exactly, games are even more expensive in other places where, like in Canada, they're like $80, which is insane. Because of that, for some people, the games that they do want and they do want to play, like they have to think about it. So that's the first point. For this, I think that this is valid, right? This is a completely valid reasoning for not wanting to purchase a game or feeling dissatisfied with a purchase because it didn't have everything that you wanted to. But here's the issue, guys. Here's the issue that I see a lot, and that's that saying a game is bad, though. It's one thing to say that a game is maybe not worth it for you personally, but to say that a game is straight up bad because it isn't like as long as you thought you were going to be, hold on there. Hold on. Let's back up and take a look at that one. Is a game bad if it's short? Let's say you have a game right here. This is a dog right here. Two dogs. One very long dog and one very small dog. Is this dog objectively better than this dog because it took me longer to pet this dog because of how much bigger it is and how much longer it is? Shut up, boss. No, it's not. Thank you for watching. That's it. That's it. We've solved it. We solved it. We solved the issue. Games are not bad if they're short. Yeah, no, obviously, that's not all that there is to it. Both dogs are objectively good. And if we're talking about pure quality, no one would ever realistically say this about a game being bad solely on its length, unless you really need to touch grass. And don't worry, we'll talk about you later if you need to touch some grass, right? So games on the short side usually prioritize quality over quantity to begin with. And let's go over some examples, right? So I've enjoyed some short games infinitely more than I have some longer ones. And here's some examples of some of those kinds of games. Untitled Goose Game. If you didn't play Untitled Goose Game and walk away like super happy from that game, I don't think you have a heart. Fury is a really cool boss rush kind of game. You can finish it in like maybe 7 to 8 hours. Pretty difficult, but I really enjoyed it. A Short Hike is such a comfy game. Literally has short in the name. Like, yeah, I finished it in like maybe 1 or 2 sittings, and I loved it. It was like such a chill, cozy game. It looked just like a DS game. It was awesome. You're telling me A Short Hike isn't an 80-hour deep story experience? And Katana Zero is also another really cool short game. It's like this 2D action side scroller. But here's the thing, though. Here's the thing with every single one of these games. They're all indie games. And indie games are usually on the cheaper side. These games don't cost $60, $70. They will range anywhere from like 10 to 20-ish. Usually on sale a lot too for cheaper. So these aren't the kinds of games that people are usually talking about when they're talking about games not being worth their value. I didn't even finish everything that there is to do in a lot of these games. Also, shut up, Kim. Let's look at the opposite side of this discussion, right? If anything, what I would argue before I actually get to this point, these games aren't just short, but I would argue that they're good because they're short, right? If Untitled Goose Game was like 40 hours long and like hundreds upon hundreds of missions and different like things like to annoy people with, I wouldn't have liked it anywhere near as much as I do now, with it just being like a game you can beat in like 3 hours and call it a day. Fury just skips the goon slaughter and jumps straight to the part that people actually want to play. Yeah, that's what I feel about Will. Like, Fury wouldn't have been anywhere near as fun if like there was levels in between the different boss fights that you had to trudge through, right? You just go from boss to boss and get to the best parts of the game. I think these games are better because they're short and because they do what they want to do. They have an idea or they have something to say. They're able to express that idea in a concise amount of time, and then they don't waste your time by being super overbloated just for the sake of having more content, right? And that's what makes these games strong. The flip side of that are the two genres in particular. And also, just to clarify, I like these games, some of these games, right? And these two games are RPGs, specifically JRPGs, and open world games. When talking about JRPGs, a lot of these games are really good. I like pretty much every game that I put here, right? I like every game that I put here. These games, specifically JRPGs, are like hundreds of, at least every single game that I've listed here. I haven't played Bravely Default 2 though. But they're at least 70 hours long, right? It's practically a part-time job to play through a lot of these games. Persona 5 took me like 115 hours to beat, and I still haven't even seen everything that there is to do in that game. But like, how much of those 115 hours is you going through like a 20-hour prologue? And people who like tell you to play the game are like, oh dude, it gets so good after like the first 15 hours. It gets so good after like once you learn like once you get through the first part, and like having to sit through all the dialogue and hear the story and wait for the game to get interesting. And that, I feel like that whole debate is like an entirely different conversation that's related to this. To be fair to JRPGs, they need a lot of this, like they need that time, because these games are usually a lot more complicated than your standard traditional game. Especially me thinking about like stuff like Xenoblade 2 or Fire Emblem 3 Houses. If you've never played a game like that before, and you're like, you need that time to like kind of get adjusted to all of those systems and mechanics, because they go so deep. A lot of this content isn't the best. There's a lot of grinding. There's a lot of time where you're just spent having to arbitrarily get to a level cap that you need to get to in order to like just continue progress in the game. And a lot of that isn't fun, grinding in JRPGs and stuff, right? Is it a job when you pay to play it? It's like a reverse job. Yeah, I don't think a lot of people, and that's part of the reason why a lot of people don't like JRPGs, because they take so freaking long to play. Like seriously, it's like it takes longer to play these games than I like have to work in a week, right? Or a lot of people have to work in a week. I don't know what I'm gonna do to edit this water bottle on the video. Your favorite part about Xenoblade 2 is ejecting the cartridge and putting it in the garbage. Sometimes it felt like that. Sometimes it felt like that, right? Currently working on getting a part-time job of Genshin. So let's go to the other side of that, now that you mentioned that, Zatara. The other side of this is open world games. And I feel like out of the two that I specifically picked, out of these two genres, open world games are the particular big offender. Why did I post this game screenshot 3 times? Blame Breath of the Wild. I think that also says a lot about the state of open world games right now. Open world games, I think, are an interesting case, because with open world games, they're specifically marketed in a way where they're marketed for the huge amount of content that they have. There's an expansive open world for you to explore with so many things in it. There's like endless content, pretty much. So many things to do, so many things to see, so many things to collect. How many of this is actually good? How much of this is like you like, oh, and God forbid it's a Ubisoft open world game where the map is just littered with dots on the screen and it's just a checklist of things like just go over. How much of that actual content is just like fetch quests where you just go and grind to find collectibles? Side quests where that don't even mean anything. Only a handful of side quests in the game are actually good and like meaningful and actually doing something interesting instead of just having you go off, hey, go kill these guys, hey, go get me this thing. How many of it is, God forbid, like walk and talk where you're just like not actually playing anything and you're just walking, traveling from point A to point B while listening to somebody talk to you about the game itself? My point being that a lot of the content that open worlds pride themselves on isn't actually worthwhile, and if anything, it just takes up your time. I will acknowledge that I'm generalizing here, and that not every open world game falls prey to this. A lot of them do. Like, even games that I do like, I think the only one I do like here that I put is Horizon. I haven't finished it, which also, well, yeah, like, I haven't finished it because it's so long. And it's not the only game I've played. I've also made the mistake of playing Genshin, but that's another conversation. How come Breath of the Wild isn't one of the only games? Because I feel Breath of the Wild, the reason why I didn't put Breath of the Wild is because Breath of the Wild is actually good. No, that's a simple oversimplification with it. I think Breath of the Wild actually does a lot of stuff to get around that, which is really cool. Because, like, the only thing that game asks of you, there's only two things that game asks of you, is to beat the tutorial, then get off the Great Plateau, and kill Ganon. Everything you do in between that is completely up to you. And yeah, there are some things that, like, you know, like Korok seeds and shrines. But I feel like the thing with, like, I see a lot of people get mad about Korok seeds and stuff like that. But I think a lot of people overlook that you weren't supposed to go and find all of them. I feel like that 100% completion is part of everyone's brain was like, oh, I have to get everything, right? But I think the game actually does make it a clear example that you don't have to get everything. And it specifically shows that by, like, not having a huge reward. In fact, making fun of you pretty much for going out of your way to get every single, like, all 1,000 of them in the game. This is kind of a short side tangent with open world games and Breath of the Wild and content. But Breath of the Wild is so interesting because, like, it actually has, you know, a lot of stuff that you can go out to explore. Like, you can just see something off in the distance and just go off to it and be like, oh, what's that? And there's nothing stopping you from actually going and doing that. And because the game is only ever prioritizing with you with only one thing to do, which is to beat Ganon, everything you do is sort of in preparation for that and is like leading up towards that actual fight. And it makes instead of all the content feeling kind of monotonous and slow because of that, it feels, most of the content in that game feels worthwhile and meaningful because it's all being built up towards that actual task. But it does do some things, not a lot. In comparison to almost every other open world game, it doesn't do a lot of the things that open worlds, like all the sins that open worlds are known for. We got sidetracked there. We got pretty sidetracked there. But yeah, just because a game is long doesn't mean all of its content is good. We've established that the longevity of a game doesn't automatically equal quality. You can have good short games. You can have bad short games. You can have good long games. You can have bad long games. But here's the problem that we still have. We haven't solved this issue yet. And that's because longevity is subjective. I can look at this cat right here in the middle and say, man, that's a long cat. But then someone else can look at that same cat and be like, that cat is nothing. Check out my Heaven Ascension level 95 super long cat and be like, this cat is nothing compared to this cat, like, that I think is long. This cat may be long to me, but to someone else, that cat may not be long at all. And this cat may be super short to me, but it could be a pretty long cat to somebody else. Let me show you an example, something I've seen personally, about people viewing length in games completely differently to others. When people say there's no content in the game, they usually say it because of one or two things. And this is going to relate to the whole idea of longevity. They usually say one or two things. They either say it because A, they beat the game really fast in comparison to when they got the game, or B, it's because the game in question doesn't have a lot of post-game content to really keep them playing the game once they beat it. I want to show you guys 2 examples of games that I have seen this for. 2 games in particular, but 2 game series, right, that I've seen this. Anyone want to take a random stab at what these games are? Animal Crossing? Good. That's a good... Ooh. I think Okay, so Animal Crossing is not one of them, right? Animal Crossing is not one of them. But I think that's also a really interesting case when it comes to longevity in games. Because that game came out. And I played it for like 115 something hours, right? And I know a lot of people put way more time into that game. And people who put more time into that game felt like that there was not enough content in it compared to other Animal Crossing games, which if you look at it objectively, I mean, like, I admittedly have not touched the game since last year. No, 2 years ago now. When they added swimming, I think that was like summer of 2020. That was the last time I touched the game. And I know they've added a lot now, but the game still doesn't have a lot of content compared to other Animal Crossing games, but people still were able to play that game for a ton. And I think that game is a really interesting scenario because of the time it came out, where that game was not meant for people to grind out like how they did. But because of the circumstances of the world, people did grind that game out. And that affected a lot of people's viewpoints on it. I'd be really interested to see what reality and how people felt about New Horizons if none of that happened, right? Like, how people would feel about the level of content in that game if it didn't release in the current circumstances. So anyway, the first one is every single Pokemon game that came out since, like, I don't know, in the past, like, 10 years. Literally every single game. All of them have varying levels of post-game content. From having a little bit in, like, you know, Sun and Moon, to having almost none in other cases. Every single one has had, like, a huge discussion about how much post-game content there is in modern Pokemon games. I've heard from people saying that there is fine enough content, like, people that are able to enjoy the game afterwards, like, you know, collecting all the Pokemon, finishing the Pokedex, and also people complaining about there not being enough post-game content, and always comparing it to, like, the last few, like, you know, the earlier games. I would say the games up until, like, Black and White, right? Shut up, boss. A lot of people would agree that endgame content and, post-game content hasn't been as in-depth and fleshed out when compared to other games before, like the gold standard. That was a pun. It's gold and silver, and, you know, other games in the series. You know what other game I've heard been described with their idea that there is no content? Monster Hunter Rise. I've seen it from plenty of Monster Hunter fans that this game has no content, that there's not enough monsters in it, that there's not enough quests, and I'm sitting here like, huh? Like, huh? What are you guys? Did we play the same game? It took me like 60 hours to beat that game. I have 2 friends. I love them to death. They're 2 of my best buds. They are Monster Hunter fiends. They beat this game the weekend it came out and, like, say, like, this game doesn't have enough content, that there's not enough, like, I spent so much time playing this game before I even beat it. And I didn't spend a lot of that time. I mean, I spent some of that time, you know, just, like, grinding it. Like, you know, doing grinding and, like, you know, leveling up my equipment and stuff. But it's like, did we play the same game? Because I felt perfectly satisfied with the amount of content in that game, right? It's just so weird to me. But this goes to just prove my point that I was making earlier about longevity, and that it's completely subjective. You think playing Monster Hunter Friends is what fleshes the game out and fleshes the game? Yeah, for sure. A lot of my playtime was playing with the homies and, like, grinding up and doing quests together. And I think, well, objectively, quests do take longer if you play with them with friends because of the way the game scales difficulty depending on how many people you're playing with. But also just, like, because when you play with friends, you, like, play. At least in my case, I wanted to play the game for more. So maybe that's why I didn't feel like that, and maybe a lot of, like, that's primarily coming from a lot of the people who play Monster Hunter single player. Maybe that's that side of the, like, the Monster Hunter community that was saying stuff about Monster Hunter Rise. Love Monster Hunter Rise, but finish all the quests relatively quickly. updates have been keeping the quest and playing online. Exactly, yeah. And that's completely valid, Como. That's completely valid that, like, you're able to finish the game super quickly. Like, people play games at different rates. And because of how quickly people may play games, they may walk away from the same experience feeling differently about it. People can say that a game has no content when talking about two completely different experiences in terms of the actual amount of content that they have. They can say it for longer games, but they can also say it for shorter games. So what do people really mean when they say that a game has no content? And here's what they actually really mean. This game wasn't worth the money I paid for it. They felt like they burnt their money with an experience and that it didn't add up to everything that they wanted out of the game in terms of length. Ultimately, that's where this conversation stems from, is that people felt like they wasted their money on something that they wanted to play. And this is exclusively talking about length when evaluating the game's length, right? It's completely fine for you to feel like the game wasn't worth it for you personally. But just because it wasn't worth it for you doesn't mean the game is objectively bad. A game isn't objectively bad just because of the amount of content. And we went over that a little bit before, but let's go more into depth about like why that is. So people view prices in correlation with perceived value, right? And this goes back to games getting more expensive, right? And things like, just costing more. If people are spending more money on something, they expect the value of that thing that they're getting to be satisfying for them. When it comes to games, people appreciate it when price is like, around equal to its value, right? Or when a price is lower than the actual value that you get for a game. If I had to compare this like to actual games, like I would say like Hollow Knight is an example of a game like on the left where you're getting a lot of value for the price that you're getting. That game should not be $15 for the amount of content and the quality of that content that you get in that game. So people are really satisfied with stuff like that. People usually don't like when games end up on the right side of the scale, where they feel like the price level of a game weighs more than the actual content that it gets. But a game's value isn't directly quantifiable by its price. I feel like there's no objective way to like correlate a game's price tag to its cost. Like there isn't a definitive amount of content. Like there isn't a baseline, right? There isn't a baseline for this game having a $60 game needs to have X amount of content. It needs to last me X amount of hours for me to feel like it's justified, right? And I feel like you can't really evaluate games like that because there's so much more that goes into making games and how hard it is to actually develop them. I feel like the quality usually comes first, at least for me personally. Some people may feel differently. And again, that's completely fair. But I feel like you can't expect games to really have a baseline of content based solely on its price tag, because that's just not how experiences work. And I think it's really weird because you don't see this level of discussion around almost any other form of medium, right? Or like form of media or form of art. Like no one reads a book and goes like, man, that book was good, but I wish there was like 50 more pages. Like it felt like there should have been like another 100 pages or so. I didn't think it was worth reading through it, right? No one goes into a movie and says like, oh man, like Spider-Man No Way Home was only 2.5 hours instead of 3 hours. Not worth me seeing it, right? People don't talk about that when it comes to other mediums, but they do with games. And I find that really weird. And I think that also speaks a lot about like how people consume games in comparison to other mediums of entertainment. We've gone over that games can be good regardless of their length. And in terms of value and quality of a game, shouldn't be entirely defined by how long it is and how much you played it for. But people just still aren't satisfied. How many times have you like gone through Steam reviews for something and just see arbitrarily that a game isn't worth it because it's short? Love the game, but I don't feel like it was worth $20 due to how short it is. If it were longer, it would get boring, as it isn't replayable. So I don't recommend it. But it is a good game. But this one is about a short hike. It's such a short game, not worth it for the $20 I paid. It's like, bro, the game literally has a short hike in its name. What did you expect? Literally, what did you expect from it? This game is too short. I paid $8 for it and finished it in 30 minutes. Not a good deal. Imagine spending countless hours making a game and putting your heart and soul into it. And then some guy on Steam like just writes a review like this and is like, oh my gosh. It's a fun game to play, but for the price, it's way too short. This game is good. You get a laugh out of it, but it's way too expensive for being that short. Wait for a 40% discount. And look at their. I also want to point out their play times too. 2.4 hours, almost 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours, 0.5 like actual 30 minutes, right? And it's like people just still walk away arbitrarily bashing games. So many of these reviews are like, the game is good, but it's too short, not recommended. Simply because of it being short. They liked what they played, but they write it off simply because it being short, right? Here is my issue with this, and I will just see this non-stop about games and people writing games off just simply because of their length. And I think this stems from something. I would like to think that when it comes to people evaluating games and evaluating games for length, I would have liked to think that a lot of people dislike or feel like a game wasn't worth it for their value because of what we went over earlier, right? Where like, you know, these valid reasons, right? But unfortunately, that's not the case, as we just seen. I think a lot of this, what this stems from, is what I like to call, and what I think is an actual problem in just like gamer, how people view and experience games, is what I like to call grind culture. We've gotten a lot of games over the past few years, like Destiny, like Warframe, that just have endless amounts of content. And these games aren't designed to have that much content just because. They're designed to have that much content to keep you playing the game, to keep you spending money on the game. Look at this dude in his room. This dude hasn't seen the sun in 35 hours. He's grinding out Genshin. He's got his waifu Eula there. He hasn't slept. He hasn't seen the sun. He hasn't touched grass. Like, he's just like, he's trapped. He can't get himself out. So I feel like games like these have formed the mentality among a lot of gamers. And I'm going to be honest, it's a lot of Zoomer gamers or people that have nothing better to do in their lives. Games like these have formed the mentality that games in general need to be like hundreds and hundreds of hour-long experiences. And that if I am not able to grind this game out and play it every waking moment of my life, then it's not worth it and it's a bad game. And not every game needs to do that. Like, it's fine if some games do it, but also recognize that when a lot of games that are being developed like this are being developed predatorily to take advantage of you and your money, right? Gamers who like actively go out and like complain about games being too short are the reason why more companies are forcing their developers, because a lot of these developers don't want to spend overtime and crunch making hundreds of different side quests and like hundreds of different like items and everything to collect. They haven't seen their family in like 4 to 5 days because they're the people in charge and their executives are like, no, this game needs to have a huge ton amount of content in order for us to justify and like get their money. People complaining that short games have no content are the reason why developers are forced to pump out super over bloated games with content that may not actually end up being good because of gamer responses like that. And that's also super annoying too. And like, not every game needs to conform to this. Like, you can have a game and just like have it say what it needs to say, and then it's good. And then like it just like you move on from it. Not every game needs to take up every waking moment of your life and every little bit of your free time. Sometimes you can just play a game. It's over. You had fun with it. You move on. And I know that not everyone is able to do that because not everyone can play every game, right? But for those that do play a lot of games, and for those that do have that mentality of like, oh, this game was too short, not everything needs to be like, you like move on. You don't need to like grind out a game forever. The simple man, game is short, play it again. Exactly. And replaying games is also another option. And games may not also need stuff like content to be super replayable. Sometimes a game can just come out and do what it wants to do, and like you don't replay it ever again. A lot of these games that I mentioned earlier, like the indie games, like Untitled Goose Game and stuff, I love what I played of it, and have I ever touched the games again? No, but I still look back on them fondly. You don't need to always play through and like grind out every single game. There are so many games out there to play. There are so many games. I guarantee you that more than half of the people who unreasonably complain that games are too short have a massive backlog of so many games that they could play but aren't playing. You probably have so many games that you could be playing. So instead of complaining that a game is too short, play another game you haven't played before. There are so many games to play right now. Short and cheap games too. Just because a game is longer doesn't mean it's longer for good reasons. Exactly, Kevy, exactly. I'm a simple man. A game is short, get back on Valorant. I don't think that's a really good answer, boss, but I can't say that I'm completely numb to that and I'm completely, like, you know, separated because, you know, here's the other problem. Sometimes I'll have games that I do want to play and games that are short, and then I just play Valorant instead. What about fighting games? Fighting games is a really interesting, I think multiplayer games are a really, not side aspect of it, but aspect of this discussion, because the amount of content that they have and how much value and mileage you get out of it solely depends on either do you have friends to play with or how long do you actually like end up playing the game. A multiplayer game can have a little amount of content. Like fighting games in general just don't have a lot of content. They don't. There's nothing much to do in most fighting games outside of just play matches with people. And I think that's actually a big problem that the genre needs to tackle in order to be able to get more casual people invested into actually playing and sticking with the game. So to sort of wrap things up, what have we learned today, right? Video game length does not equate to quality. People are justified in wanting more content out of their purchase, but at the same time, more people just need to learn to enjoy things and move on. And that's shown here with an average 85-hour video game zoomer grinder who is complaining about a game only taking 10 hours to beat, compared to the average gamer who can enjoy things and enjoy a game for what it does and move on. Today we learned that Ramen likes short games because he can actually finish them. Yeah, there you go, boss. You found me out. You found me out. That's all what it equated to.